Alright everybody, welcome in. My name's Joe and let's play some chess. So here's the game I got to play recently. I started off with a knight to f3. This is that ready opening, something I've been playing a lot lately and I really enjoy it. This knight to c6 response I'm not familiar with. I have not seen this before, but that's okay. The reason I like these flexible openings is because it gives me an opportunity to react to what my opponent's doing, but also to put them off book too. This doesn't stop anything that I want to do, so I continue to go. I'm going to fianchetto my bishop. And in fact, I've been looking at games lately. I've been looking to get into this double fianchetto lines if I can. I find that if I can get there, they just make games so much more interesting to me, and so I've been trying to go that route whenever I can. My opponent pushed his king's pawn, so, you know, controlling the center. And what do we do when we see the king's pawn? Well, whenever we have these king's Indian positions, whether from white or black, push d6 or d3 in this case, basically helping to control in front of our knight so that this pawn doesn't come with tempo. My opponent pushed d5, continued to develop controlling the center. I got fianchettoed and I'm ready to castle. I should have castled at this point in time. This is really what I should be doing, is castling. But like I said, I've been trying to push these double fianchetto lines, so I got a little hungry, and I decided to go ahead and force the double fianchetto. Notice my opponent's bishop is not fianchettoed, so he is not attacking, and pushing this pawn does not drop a rook. Keep that in mind. And so I decided to go for it. At this point in time, my opponent decided to go ahead and break apart the center, right? Neither one of us is castled. Both of our kings are in the center, but he's going to go ahead and take the initiative and break apart the center. Well, that's why we have this pawn for, so we went ahead and traded. Now, you're going to see one of the dangers whenever you do a fianchetto setup. What's the danger with a fianchetto? Well, you're weakening. Notice that these squares are now weakened because there's no pawn there. These squares are weakened because there's no pawn there. Now the bishop's job is to control those, but when the bishop's not there or the bishop isn't defended, that becomes a problem. So my opponent could trade queens, or I could trade queens. I could just straight up castle here and drop a knight. I need to do something with my knight. I thought about, so this is one of the decisions I had to make. I thought about rotating the knight back, immediately putting pressure on this. Notice it's got two attackers, my opponent's only got one defender. But then what happens if he pushes? Okay, I could just rotate right back and then have an attacker here, but then he takes, and then I have to take, and now I've even weakened my king side even more. Or I have to just straight up take, and again, weaken my king side. Now, it's not the end of the world to weaken your king side like this. It's not the end of the world. When I castle, in some of the King's Indian lines, we push the f-pawn anyway to kind of break open the center, but the centers are busted open. Both of our kings are exposed. I wasn't in love with this position. My opponent can easily start attacking my e-pawn, can easily bring in, you see what I'm saying? So I didn't love this idea. So when my opponent took, I had to decide what to do with my knight. So I knew that I wasn't going to castle. I knew that rotating the knight in front of the queen wasn't going to work, so I was going to leave my queens exposed. If I ever want to castle, I'm not going to be, I don't want my opponent to trade queens, so I decided to go ahead and trade queens early. My opponent's knight being here gave him the opportunity to recapture without giving up castling privileges, so good on my opponent. Now my knight is still hanging. But again, the same dilemma applies. Do I go, knight to d3 or d2 and attack the pawn, knowing that my opponent can just push? Because if my opponent pushes now, I've got the bishop covering it, which is what I want. So I rotated the knight up and away, which is also kind of a theme, right? Whenever we play the King's Indian, whether it's an attack or on the defensive side, one of the themes, it's more strongly on from playing from the black side, King's Indian from the black side. Not as strong of a theme, but also something to keep in mind. Sometimes on the King's Indian from the white side, we are going to be pushing that f-pawn, and so we move the knight out of the way, push the f to break open the center, and then use the knight to either support or to drop back. In this case, by rotating my knight out of the way, I immediately attack. So I now have 2 attackers. My opponent only has 1 defender. So I'm now attacking this pawn. Right now, the material is dead even. We have not done anything. The material is dead even. My opponent defends the pawn. So now, 2 attackers, 1 defender. Here's where some of the issues run in. Notice, I now have 3 attackers. My opponent only has 2 defenders. He needs to defend this pawn. Well, he can't defend this pawn another time. But what he can do is remove one of the attackers. Notice this is a pin, and this is an undefended piece. So now I need to defend this piece, and I'd really like to... Normally I was going to stick my bishop here to defend the piece, but I kind of want to do it while removing the pin at the same time. So I make a move. I defend my knight with the bishop, and now this fianchetto structure, since I never got the fianchetto, is a weakness. And it's something that I have to keep in mind, that by trying to force this double fianchetto, I forced myself into a suboptimal position. So I should have just gone with the flow of the game and castled first and done things that I would normally do first. Notice if I had castled, I could have stuck my rook under here and helped support any defenses that I need to. If I had castled, my rook would have been sitting here, so that if my opponent did bust open the center and I had to move my f-pawn, I would already have had a rook on the open f-file. So these are the things that would have happened if I played the game normally. I decided to take some chances, and I ended up in this position. Now, let's do some tactics. I have 1, 2, 3 attackers in this pawn now. My opponent only has 2 defenders in this pawn. So I'm winning a pawn, right? Maybe not, because at any point in time my opponent can take this knight, removing one of the attackers and leaving only 2 attackers for 2 defenders. So I had to do some calculations in my head. This is one of the lines I was looking at. If my opponent takes, I take back with the bishop. At some point in time, all my opponent has to do is push their outside pawn, and I'm in trouble. Well, I thought, well, at this point in time, I can grab the knight here. If my opponent takes, I haven't castled, and so I'm not scared of an open h-file. And at this point in time, there's a pawn, a loose pawn here. So I can go up a pawn in this way. Now, I do have to be really careful because, oh no, my bishop is going to be trapped if I'm not careful. Well, luckily in this case, there's no pawn here, and so I'm not trapped, so I can squeeze out. If my opponent were to can't castle now because through check, but if my opponent were to put a rook here, I can always retreat my bishop, so I'm fine. So this was one line that I calculated. The other line that I calculated was if my opponent pushes the h-pawn now, and then I take with the knight, right, getting it out. Now my opponent has 1, 2 attackers. I have 1, 2 defenders. All he has to do is remove one of the defenders. Then I calculated, well, I have this because it comes with check. My opponent would have to figure that out, and then I can grab here, and that would, we'd still have the same number of pieces, but that would give me the free pawn and mess up my opponent's structure. So that was another line I calculated. So I'm thinking that, you know what, I'm doing okay here. I'm gonna make this work. Is there a third line that my opponent could play? Well, what if he pushes? Well, crap. Now I can't move the bishop because the bishop's the only thing defending the knight. So any way we look at it, I have to mess up my pawn structure in front of my king. I have to open the f-file. Neither one of us are castled. The center is wide open. This could be getting pretty ugly for me. All right, so what happened in the game? My opponent pushed h6 immediately. I grabbed, and in this case, he grabbed back. Now, he could have grabbed back with either piece. He grabbed back, and now I have to calculate again, okay? Because there are 2 very distinct lines here. And at any point in time, you guys pause, and you tell me if you see the differences between 2 different lines. Which way do I capture back? One of them wins the pawn. The other loses a piece. Big difference. If, for instance, I had grabbed with the bishop, and Now you think, well, no big deal. Your opponent just grabs. Everybody's happy, even preserving castling privileges. Grabs. Now what? This bishop can't do anything. Yeah, okay, there's a pawn here, but I'm down a piece right now, so I have to get my piece back. There's nothing defending this. Now, instead of going up a pawn, I'm down a piece. With tempo, I now have to start scrambling to get in a better position. Okay, maybe I could pick up a pawn here, right? But, things can get ugly really fast. So, being down a piece, not good. So I realized that what I have to do is I have to take with the knight. And now, no matter what my opponent does, if he captures with check, I can rotate the knight back. 2 pieces to 2 pieces. I'm up a pawn. I grab with the knight. If he grabs here, I have my choice to take back. And in both cases, I'm safe because either I take, notice there's 2 attackers here, either I remove one of the attackers or I remove one of the attackers and my opponent can't take back. So either way, I'm getting my piece back. Over the game, I had to decide which one do I want to take back. I don't know that it really matters. And I've tried to look at this with an engine, and I let the engine go as deep as it could, and it says that capturing with the bishop is better because notice that there's no takebacks, and so it's 2 pieces, I'm up a pawn, I have a bishop pair versus the knight pair, whereas taking with the bishop, it allows this trade. And now we only have 1 piece each. I can't castle, but this is what I saw over the board, and this is why I struggle sometimes agreeing with the engine, even when I let it go to a million lions deep. We're now in an endgame, and we're in an endgame. I have a clear attack. My opponent has to defend the attack. My king is already active. So my king is moving up the board somewhere, getting active. I have 2 pawn islands. My opponent has 2 pawn islands. I'm going to activate my rooks one way or the other, but my king is already active. And I felt like, in my mind, I felt that, you know what? When it comes to end games, the king needs to be active. The king is an attacker and a defender. And the new me, who's trying to get better at end games, saw this and saw that that's what I want to do. Is I want to play some games where my king is active. I want to get my king involved in the game. So this is the line that I actually went for. Over the board, I went, I'll take the knight. I'm going to give you my bishop so that I can activate my king. Now my opponent has to defend this pawn, and there's a couple ways they could do it. My opponent chose to defend with a knight. You can see the engine doesn't like that move. The engine really wants him just to defend with a pawn and keep the knight for other uses. I'm going to turn the engine off, but my opponent defended this way. And now I'm just going to bring one of my rooks over to the open file. But before I do that, my king is active, so I decided to slide it up into this structure. Right? There's a structure here. I can either stick my king underneath, or I can push a pawn. Use my king as a defender of the base of the pawn chain. I'm feeling really good about this at this point in time. My opponent does the smart move. This is a good move, and I should have seen this coming. Castling long automatically gives him the open file. Oh yeah, so I was debating on picking a rook, sticking it over here, challenging him for the open file. At this point in time, we've traded off so much material that it's pretty obvious we're going into an end game where I'm just up a pawn. That is not an overwhelming advantage in anybody's book. For me, all right, maybe Magnus, maybe the world champion, maybe some of the champion, the super GMs, the Hikaros of the world, the Ferrugias of the world, right? These super upper echelon, top 10 players in the world could probably figure out when, can win an end game with their eyes closed, up a pawn. Regular guys like me, not going to happen. A single pawn advantage is not enough. So I feel like we're very even. It's an end game. My king is active. I'm comfortable. So I'm debating on sticking a rook over. I decide, you know what? I can do one more thing. I can trade off my bishop. My opponent pretty much has to take back isolating pawns. And now you see where New Joe comes in, right? New Joe is studying endgames. I saw this over the board. This is the decision I made consciously to isolate pawns in an endgame. I challenged the open file. Now, I honestly thought that my opponent would simply just push his rook up. Notice all 3 of these squares are defended, so he could have easily pushed his rook up, encourage me to trade, and fix his pawn structure. I probably would have gone here, knowing that we're going to double up, he's going to double up his rooks. Knowing that if I take, he can then build a pawn chain in the center of the board that he can defend with his king, or even over here and defend both of these. In this particular case, my opponent decided to trade, and I was so happy here. At this point in time, I now have the open file. I can now get my rook up. Okay, so again, these 3 are covered, so I can only get my rook up halfway across the board, but at least getting it up halfway felt like, okay, now I control a ton of the board. Attacking one of my loose pawns, defend the pawn, and now we're pushing. So now New Joe, again, studying endgames, goes, okay, how do I spent a lot of time on this position. How do I convert this? Right, this is my weakness. I have what I feel is an advantage. I have 2 islands. My opponent has 3 islands. My opponent has isolated pawns. I feel really good that I'm in a position where my end game is going to work. My king is active. I can start walking my king up to control more of the board. So I tried this outside pawn push, knowing that my opponent, who has been trading away willy-nilly, not willy-nilly, but has been happy to trade away, my opponent would love a draw at this point in time. I feel, playing from the black pieces, getting into a draw. My opponent decided to trade, so I figured he would trade. I traded. Now this and this for a barrier. I have 2-to-1 majority here, and I have a single pawn island versus isolated pawns. This should be a winning endgame. The experts would tell you this is a winning endgame. And if I turn on the evaluation says I have a winning position even though I'm only up 1 point of material. I'm only up 1 pawn, but it's a 5-point advantage because this is a winning endgame for white because white's king is active. White has a 2-to-1 here. This is a connected versus isolated. Like, this should be winning. Now I'd have to figure out how to convert it. My opponent decides to push. I make a change of plan here. I don't want this open file anymore. What I want is this row. That's the row I want to control. So I can't get there from here, but I can get there from here. So my eye is now on the G6 square for my rook. I slide over. My opponent puts his rook behind a pawn. It's not a passed pawn yet. And in fact, this pawn I'm going to use to my advantage. Again, I'm so proud of myself for seeing these things, for getting better at these endgames. I'm not there yet. This just happens to be an example of where I did good. So Joe did good in this game. I get my rook to the G6 square. I've got eyes on both pawns. Now my opponent pushes. Old Joe would have taken and let my opponent's rook infiltrate, have 2 targets. I can't defend both, so I would take to defend, take, maybe back, still have, be up pawns, but my opponent's rook is now on the loose. Old Joe would have done that. New Joe doesn't do that. New Joe sees that if my opponent takes, I take, which then means my opponent's rook has to move another tempo, and this pawn now slides over closer to my king. My king can defend both pawn bases. See? Big brain time. I simply gobble up a pawn. Either one would have been fine. I decided to grab the outside pawn because now I have an outside passed pawn that my opponent has to deal with. And if we look at the other side of the board, my opponent has weaknesses on the other side of the board. So I might be able to create 2 outside passed pawns. My opponent takes, I slide up, and now my king can control both of these pawn chains. My opponent immediately brings his king out. I get my king out, just basically stopping my opponent from advancing too much with his king. I need to defend. Old Joe would have pushed a pawn and given up the base of the pawn chain. New Joe says, not so much, buddy, not so much. First I throw a check in, and then I defend both of my pawns. And all of that, I'm very happy to say that I actually saw over the board somehow. Not 10,000 moves, but I saw the central theme of keep your pawns close to your king because your king is a defender. A king is a crucial defender. Have an active king. Now my rook is on the wrong side of my passed pawn, but that's okay. My opponent wastes time. I know he's probably going to go for this. At any point in time, I can push this outside passed pawn to create to strengthen it, and then my king is defending both of these. And as long as my king is hanging around defending these guys, I should be okay. Gives me a chance to push my pawn. And just move my king. No big deal. He goes back. Instead of going back, Big Brain Joe goes down because now I'm attacking the rook, and he can't come here, and he can't check me. He would have to go all the way over here. And as long as he goes all the way over here, I can defend that. He's going to have to spend some time bringing his king in to try to dislodge me somehow. And I've got a passed pawn. So he moves. I know he's probably going to try to get up here. That's fine. I push my pawn. Gives me a chance to get my rook. And so now my opponent has a problem. Now my pawn is too far advanced. In this position, how do I guarantee that this pawn promotes? Old Joe doesn't know. Old Joe would abandon and start picking up other pawns. He would trade pawn for pawn and then try to use these connected passed pawns. New Joe knows that if this rook gives a check, this game is over. Because if I give a check, then the opponent has to move the king. Doesn't matter where, because then I get queen. If he takes my rook, well, he can't because it's protected. But yeah, I give a check. The king has to move somewhere, even if he's attacking here. I promote a queen. He has to take. I pick up his rook. So if my opponent allows me to check his king, I can't sacrifice my rook, right? If he slides back here, I can't sacrifice the rook because then he would pick up my rook and the passed pawn. But I know that my opponent has to hide the king or put the king on one of these back squares. Those are the only moves he can make to prevent losing this game on the spot. And unfortunately, my opponent slides up. I can see what he's trying to do. He's trying to get his king active. Notice these squares are taken away, so he has to come this way and sort of keep his king active and keep my king passive. But unfortunately, check. He has to do something with his king. He tucks it away. Promote to a queen. His only choice, doesn't matter what he does, his only choice really is to give up the rook for the queen, which he does. Now it's a rook versus a king. This game is essentially over. Now the question is, can we checkmate or can my opponent stalemate? Now if you're playing from the black pieces here, black wants a stalemate because a stalemate is a draw and a draw is a win. White is just looking to straight up checkmate. I still have a passed pawn. I have a rook. My opponent is trying to stay active, and that's fine. I'm just going to slow play it to make sure I don't accidentally drop anything in the process. Now, yeah, right here. So I'm now using my king to help cut off my opponent because I know that the king and the rook are going to team up together to deliver checkmate. Essentially, I want to go on this back row, but my opponent has a pawn here. So, okay, so checkmate isn't as easy as normal. Normally, I would just basically force my opponent, take opposition, force my opponent's king into a position where I can checkmate. But in this case, Big Brain Joe stops and says, is there stalemate? Yes, there is. Notice normally you'd want the opponent's king to be able to walk up and down this back row. If it's a king versus a king and rook versus a king, the king can just walk up and down all day long across his back row, no stalemate. In this case, though, this advanced pawn was a mistake because it allows my opponent to stalemate. So these are all cut off by the rook. That's cut off by my pawn. If my opponent pushes this pawn here and blocks himself in, he could end up in stalemate. So I'm watching for that, and I decide, over the board, I decide if my opponent ever pushes, I push my outside passed pawn, you know, why not? If my opponent ever pushes, I decide that I am going to have to do one of two things. Either move my rook off, and I probably would just move it here and just start gobbling up pawns this way. These guys are all stalemated and they can't move. But I need to not, if I push here, this is stalemate, game over. Nobody can make a move. Black can't run away. Black has no squares to go to. All of these are covered. Stalemate, it's a draw. Black technically wins in that case, right? They're happy, I'm not happy. So I decide that if at any point in time, my opponent pushes this pawn, I'm going to either move my rook, which is going to allow my opponent's king to start escaping, but by that time I'll have another queen. Or if my opponent pushes this pawn, I decide I'm going to break open like this, which allows my opponent an escape square. If he were to, let's put the engine on, see what the engine says. Yeah, even this is guaranteed winning. If he takes, oh yeah, I could even slide down with the rook. He has an extra move, but then I move away, and yeah, he now has free reign to a few squares. Or I take like this, even with my pawn, and then he has to slide up. He only has one square available to him, but it's still, he at least has a square available, and then he could start running this way if he needs to. So I've decided in my head those are my two options. Either I'm going to move my rook, or I'm going to just stick my pawn up here. But I only need to do that if my opponent pushes this pawn. As long as he doesn't push this pawn, he has wiggle room back and forth between these two squares. And that's what happened in the game. I can turn this off. My opponent wiggled back and forth. I just kept pushing a pawn. He just kept wiggling back and forth. Got myself a queen. This is pretty easy. This comes with check. My opponent still, you know, has a legal move. And then there's a million different checkmates here. But, oops, not that one. I went with this one. Rook and queen team up, or king and queen team up. Either way you want to look at it. Checkmate. So we got the win. But this is kind of the power of studying endgames. I could have easily drawn this game. This game could have easily been a draw, or this game could have even been a loss if I'd not played it correctly in the endgame, if I'd not thought forward, you know, because I've done that before. I've gotten into winning positions going into the endgame and then lost because I don't know how to make those conversions. I don't know how to take that advantage and push. I'm studying. I know it doesn't look like it. It's hard for me to see. Back here, I don't know if you can see back there. There. Back here is my Stillman's endgame book that I've been reading, and it's helping me to get better at some of these things. Let me grab it real quick. Yeah, Stillman's endgame course. So it's a very big book, and I'm reading through it, trying to understand some of these positions, because little things like that, right? So this was a very mediocre opening, very mediocre middle game. A couple of tactics here, right? Nothing crazy, but a couple of tactics here. But this right here, this decision right here, the engine says I did it wrong, but I did it right because I am practicing endgames, and I wanted to be conscious of the fact that I want my king active. Yes, I lose castling privileges, but there's no queens on the board, there's no bishops on the board anymore. My king is weak in the center, but we've transitioned past that mid-game where my king is free to roam. And so, you know what? Let's get that king active. So I made a conscious decision here to take this knight, give my opponent this trade so that I could have an active king. I made a conscious decision here to trade away to isolate pawns. I made a conscious decision here to block this off, have a 2-to-1, and then give up control so that I can get back here. I made a conscious decision to use my king as a defensive tool. I made a conscious decision not to grab, but to allow my opponent to improve my own position, right? By my opponent grabbing, it improves my position because now my weak pawn can be defended by my king. Like, these are decisions I chose to make simply because I am practicing my endgames. I'm trying to get better in that mindset, and this game proves that I was able to do that. A better player would have probably done this endgame better, but I don't care. Like, I'm getting better. I'm improving. I'm using my mistakes to educate myself. And then we got into a position here where basically you have your choice of how you want to finish this game, and we got the checkmate. So thanks for sticking around, guys. I appreciate you sticking with me. Know that even if I'm not recording a video, I'm also doing other things. I promise one day we'll do some endgame training live. But we're going to keep going. We're going to keep chugging along little by little and see how we can make some improvements, all right? I hope you guys are enjoying this. I hope you guys are playing chess. I think that's so much fun just to get out and play games and see how they go. Try new things, because who cares? If you lose 1 or 2 games, you're going to win 1 or 2 games down the road anyway, so don't worry about it. Go out, play, lose, learn, and then you get better, right? Talk to you guys later. Bye.